that God is blessed. And, well, it must be that the people who God is blessed are the rich people, right? So, let's put them in charge. So, anyhow, conservative mind starts out with Sir Edmund Burke and this whole philosophy of step by step. And then Kirk gets into this warning. Now keep in mind, this is 1951-52. This was right around the time I was born. And we had had a decade at that point, after World War II, a fragment of a decade actually, of real significant industrial growth. Part of it, pent-up demand from World War II, and part of it just the natural consequences of the FDR revolution, of the New Deal, what he was doing. And what Kirk suggested was that if that middle class ever got large enough and economically self-sufficient enough, that they would become brave enough and uppity enough that they would start disrupting society, that they would actually disrupt society. And so flash forward to 1971. In 64, 65, 66, 67, we had major civil rights legislation. African Americans were saying, hey, we thought this was settled with the Civil War. What about our part of this? And by 71, we had cities on fire. You had Stonewall in 1969. You had gay people standing up saying, what about us? We're here too. We're entitled to be part of this. You had young people who were saying the Vietnam War was raging. Young people who were saying, hell no, I won't go. And by the way, why can't I even vote? About this war. We did solve that. We lowered the voting age. And interestingly, that amendment only took 6 months from the time it was introduced until 3/4 of the state ratified it. And it was largely because of Barry McGuire's song, The Eve of Destruction. And there was that line in there, you're old enough to kill but not for voting. And everybody got it. But anyhow, so you had young people in protest, you had African Americans in protest, you had gays in protest, you had women. The birth control pill had been legal since 1961. You had women demanding to be not just part of the workforce, but to be recognized as equals in the workforce and equals in society. Equals in the education, schools, in the home, just have rights. There was open discussion in 1971 about abortion. The D&C procedure that women who could afford it routinely got in hospitals all over America. But everybody knew, wink and nod, this is an abortion. This was 2 years before Roe v. Wade. And you had women burning bras and doing the whole, Gloria Steinem was out there. And you had the hippies, you had people smoking dope and getting high and saying no thanks to alcohol and caffeine, I'll try some different drugs and tune in, turn on, drop out. And just, in 1971, from the worldview, socially, the worldview of the people who were the disciples of Russell Kirk, and all the way back to Edmund Burke in the 1790s, his 1951 prophecy was coming true. America was coming unraveled. Church attendance was plummeting. Some of the churches were actually starting to talk about letting women become priests. Other churches were coming out against the war. I mean, churches were disavowing the anti-miscegenation laws that they had for years and years. The Mormon Church had not yet. They didn't do it until 78, I believe. But there was even discussion in the Mormon Church about saying that African Americans could be members of the church. I mean, everything was in chaos from the point of view of basically the old white guys. Because everybody who wasn't an old white guy was saying, hey, what the hell about me? And so socially, these conservatives were going, whoa, this is exactly what Russell Kirk predicted. That we let the middle class get big enough that now they're standing out there saying, where's mine? Meanwhile, that's the social end of it. Meanwhile, there was a business end to this. In 1964, 65, 66, I forget the year, Rachel Carlson published a book called Silent Spring, in which she pointed out that the DDT that was being sprayed, and I remember as a kid, we had to stay in during the afternoon and overnight, and the next day I'd go out and I'd dust the DDT off my dad's car, because they were spraying for mosquitoes in Lansing. They would spray from the airplanes with DDT and for mosquito control. And she pointed out that, you know, it might be toxic to humans. I mean, famously, the president of Dow Chemical had gone on television and drank a glass of it and said, "See, I'm fine." But it was certainly toxic to bugs, and they're part of the food chain. And it was causing birds' eggs not to calcify properly, so the shells were so thin that the chicks were not hatching, that they were dying, you know, just from mom sitting on them, and that was the end of that. And she said, one of these days, we get enough of this DDT out here, and winter's going to end, and the spring is going to start, and instead of seeing the butterflies and the bees and hearing the birds chirp, it's just going to be silent. And she was right, and America was horrified, and an environmental movement was birthed. And 2 years later, Ralph Nader wrote a book called Unsafe at Any Speed, in which he pointed out that the big car companies had figured out what percentage of people who were actually injured in car crashes that could have been preventable with good engineering sued, and how much money they got from those lawsuits. And they would divide that by how much money they saved by not putting that extra $3 liner in the gas tank to keep it from catching on fire. And they were just doing these cost-benefit equations and figuring out, you know, okay, well, if 10,000 people die, but we make an amount of money that's greater than, you know, we don't start losing money until 20,000 people die, then that's acceptable, we'll do that. And he laid this out in his book, Unsafe at Any Speed, and it just absolutely raised hell. And a consumer movement was birthed. And so in 1971, not only were the conservatives, the social conservatives, not only were conservatives seeing society in meltdown in their mind. Now, Thomas Jefferson would have loved this. John Adams would have been horrified by it. But Jefferson would have said, see, this is good stuff. And, you know, having been there at the time, I thought it was good stuff. You know, it seemed like a really good time. But, you know, it wasn't to the conservatives. They were like, oh my God. And then the business people were like, we are under siege. And they were. America was saying, hey, wait a minute, why do we even have an economy? We have an economy to serve the people. That's why we give special privileges to business. That's why we give them the ability to take tax deductions for 2 martini lunches and blah, blah, blah. And so if we're going to have an economy and we're going to have businesses and we're going to facilitate all this and facilitate all this stuff, then let's do it in a way that actually operates in the interests of the country. And so Lewis Powell was the soft-spoken lawyer who, when I first started writing this book, I was convinced he was evil incarnate, because the Powell memo kicked off the modern era, kicked off this whole modern thing in 1971. And the more I read about Lewis Powell, the more I read by Lewis Powell, the videos that I watched of him in his later years after he retired from the Supreme Court, the more I discovered that Lewis Powell was actually a decent man who really believed that the country had gone nuts, and who really believed that what was good for General Motors was good for America. And you know, you could argue even that there was some truth to what he was saying if you wanted to take a comfortable conservative perspective, an Eisenhower conservative, my dad's conservative perspective. Yeah, we should do all these things, but let's, instead of doing them all within 5 years, let's do them over 50. Let's do them gradually. Let's, you know, let's not, and let's not end up with cities on fire as a consequence of it. So, but the problem was, so Lewis Powell's memo said, we are under siege. I mean, it literally opens with this: American business is under siege. And in order to, and traditionally American, and he wrote this memo to his neighbor and very close friend Eugene Sindor, who was the president of the US Chamber of Commerce. And he said, traditionally business has been apolitical. We haven't taken political positions on things. But we have to now. We have to take control of the media, of public opinion. We need to create think tanks. So people will start, instead of seeing Ralph Nader and Rachel Carson on the cover of Time magazine and Life magazine, they will see, you know, business people. They'll see the president of General Motors. They will hear our point of view as well. We don't want to totally stifle theirs, but ours is not being heard. So we need to take the media. And out of that came the Charles Koch Foundation, today called the Cato Institute, and the Heritage Foundation, and the American Enterprise Institute, and all these other right-wing conservative think tanks. And he said, and we need to take the media. And out of this came, you know, the media started getting progressively more consolidated and politicized. And of course, the whole thing really, really went on steroids in 1981 with the election, or 1980 with the election of Ronald Reagan. He said we have to take the schools, and there are colleges all across America now where the economics departments are teaching literally Ayn Rand, I mean fiction, science fiction, because they're getting multi-million-dollar grants from the Koch brothers and other very wealthy billionaires and corporations to hire economists who think that the Austrian school is the answer to everything, or the Chicago school of Milton Friedman the answer to everything. We have to take the colleges. We have to take the high schools and the elementary schools. Stop teaching the history of labor. Stop teaching the genocide of the Native Americans and the genocide against the African Americans, and start talking about the dead white guys, and memorize those dates, and the benefits and the wonders of American business. We have to take our court system, and this led to the creation of the Federalist Society. We ultimately have to take political power, particularly at the local level, and this led to the creation of the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, which basically takes control of state houses. Now, all of that in and of itself wouldn't have been so terrible. I mean, it was a conservative infrastructure, but we're basically a liberal country, and we would have heard both voices, arguably, if it hadn't gone crazy. But then there was this guy named Ken Lay. And what the Powell memo had done when it was put into place, and 3 months later Richard Nixon put Lewis Powell on the Supreme Court, and he began, with like Buckley versus Vallejo, saying, well, money, this is not property. This is speech, and as speech, this is protected by the First Amendment. So, really? Yes, according to the Supreme Court. Money is speech. And then First National Bank versus Bellotti. Corporations aren't just corporations. They are people. They're entitled to protections under the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law. They can engage in political action if they want. Of course, Citizens United was the culmination, the knitting of it all together in a very, very big way in 2010. But the point is that out of this came this, out of the Reagan presidency, came this shift from the idea that we're all in it together, that the purpose of an economy is to, we give these benefits to business so that business can work with and for all of us. The purpose of an economy is for the public good. And and that the American dream is my dad's life, is the middle class life. Two, Jimmy Carter had walked to his inaugural. Ronald Reagan went in a limousine. It was a black tie affair. People paid to attend. It was the billionaires crowd. The Washington Post, a new spirit in America, the spirit of the rich. The Roaring '20s are back. And so, by the way, the second part of that 1976 story, I told you about the credit card and about the tax rates. Well, in 1921, Warren Harding, I told you, he ran on two things. One was the deregulation of more business and business, and the second was tax cuts. In 1921, he dropped the top tax rate from 91% down to 25%, just like that. And what did that do? That stopped, that conversation my CPA had with me in 1976, they stopped. Those conversations ended. And instead, all this hot money flowed into the economy in the 20s, creating the so-called Roaring '20s, which were actually pretty miserable for workers. There was no real significant growth in the middle class in the 1920s. It was all at the top end. It was all the Great Gatsby. But it looked good. It looked good. You had the Dow was going from 50 to 360. It's incredible. So the same thing happened when Reagan became president. He dropped the top tax rate from 74% down to 28%. All this hot money came in. And Ken Lay was making serious money with money. Ken Lay had figured out a scheme with Enron. But Ken Lay had a couple of problems. One problem was that one major part of his business model was he had over 800 companies in this umbrella called Enron. And most of those companies were not profitable, and they just hid their losses in those companies. And then they would shift the profits to other companies. And those companies would be the ones that they paid the stock dividends and whatnot to their executives, and Ken Lay took the money from and all that kind of thing. But the bankers were starting to catch on to this. Now, in 1935, after the Great Crash, we figured out we had never gone from the George Washington administration until 1933. From the George Washington administration until 1933, we had never gone more than 15 years in the history of the United States without a major nationwide banking panic. Never. 15 years, maximum. FDR figured it out, or John Maynard Keynes did. Said, put a wall between the banks that gamble and the banks that do checkbooks. Checkbook banks, we'll call them commercial banks. They can write home mortgages. They can give people checkbooks and savings accounts, and that's it. Heavily regulated. And the gambling banks, they can buy stocks and bonds, but they can't even offer you a checkbook. Remember, back in the 80s, I opened an account with Merrill Lynch, and they did not offer, they couldn't, by law, they could not offer a checkbook at that time. This is before the Reagan administration. So, I mean, it was just a whole long thing. So anyhow, one of Ken Lay's big problems was that the bankers were starting to figure out the scam that he was running. So he wanted to own his own bank. The other had to do with commodities, something called commodities. Let me give you just kind of Econ 101 on commodities as just an aside for just a moment, because this becomes really, really, really important to understand about the crash of 2008 and how it happened, and the crash of 2016 and what's going to happen. Let's say that I am a farmer and you all collectively own a baking cooperative. And it's spring and I'm about to plant my wheat. And I have no idea if I'm going to have a great year and just the perfect amount of sun and rain and everything else, or if it's going to be a terrible year and I'm going to get wiped out. And neither do you. You don't know that either. But you got to buy the wheat to make the bread, and I got to grow the wheat because that's what I do as a farmer. If I have a really bad year, your price is going to go up dramatically for your wheat. If I have a really good year, it's going to be really cheap. In fact, I might have such a good year, I might have so much wheat that I'll be selling it for less than it actually cost me to grow it. It happens. So how can I avoid the disaster of a really bad year and maybe not even having enough wheat to sell to people, or having such an incredibly good year that I'm selling it below my own cost of production? And how can you have some ability to budget for an entire year, how many employees you're going to have, how much rent you're going to have to, I mean, you got a lot of fixed expenses in a bakery. How can you budget for a year's worth of fixed expenses? So we cut a deal. We say, we're going to take this commodity of wheat, and we're going to create a contract between you and me that says, I will sell you typically 30 to 50% of my crop, was typically what farmers did. I'll sell you half my crop in advance, right now in March, for delivery in September, at a fixed price, $3.80 a bushel. It's a price that I can live on. It's a price that you can, predicate. It's kind of the middle price of what we all expect. And if I have a bad year or a good year, I may win, I may lose, you may win, you may lose in retrospect, but the fact of the matter is that you'll be able to budget year out, and I will not be wiped out. And these are called futures contracts, commodities futures contracts. And they've been done since the founding of the Republic. And because they got wild and crazy in the 19th century, in fact, one of the commodity futures on gold, Abraham Lincoln once made the comment, it's an epitaph or epigraph, a chapter heading in my book on equal protection. He says, those gold gamblers in New York City, I'd like to put a bullet in their foreheads. Abe Lincoln, I mean, he rarely talked like that. He was seriously PO'd. So they started regulating this stuff, and there was a federal agency that regulated commodity trades between what are called counterparties. As a baker, you're one party. As a farmer, I'm a party. They're counterparties to each other, to a commodities future trade. Right? Everybody with me? It's pretty straightforward stuff. It's not rocket science. And so there was a federal agency that regulated them, and then they also had to run through a fairly transparent trading floor. And this was typically the Chicago Board of Trade. Whether it was pork bellies, which was for the bacon industry and the restaurant industry, or whether it was wheat, or whether it was corn, or soybeans, or oil, and the airlines were really big in buying futures with the oil companies, or whatever it may be, physical commodities were regulated in these ways. So Ken Lay started lobbying the federal agency that regulated these things just really, really hard to say, allow us to trade. Up until that point, the only thing you could trade basically was physical commodities, corn, wheat, soybeans, for obvious reasons. Those, for the reasons that I just explained. You can't trade futures contracts, let's make a bet on what the price is going to be, in the future of furniture or something like that. I mean, you could make a bet, arguably on wood, but finish